Well, they could hardly believe it after all they'd been through, after everything that they'd learned and unlearned. Finally, here he was. After years of childlessness, finally, here was their son. God had heard their anguish, and that explains their son's name. It means God will hear, and he certainly had. And that explains why they were so content with Ishmael. Abraham and Sarah were so content with Ishmael. And to understand how important Ishmael is to this whole story, we need to go back to the very beginning of the story of Abraham, which we find at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. Let's just read those first 3 verses. Now, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Now, there's one particular important point in this whole section we've just read, and that's what I'd like us to concentrate on when God says to Abram, "I will make of you a great nation." This is the tremendous promise. And so that's clear then, isn't it? That throughout his life, Abraham will have to learn many things, and he'll have to unlearn many, many things. And so this is his major learning adjustment, number 1. For the first time in his life, Abraham learns that he's going to become the father of a great nation. But his story is going to be far from straightforward, much less straightforward than many of us often think it is. Because Abraham is going to have to learn many things and unlearn many, many things. Now, when Abraham learns that he's going to become a great nation, Abraham knows something. Sarai, his wife, knows something. And we know something. We know that Sarai is barren. That's what we're told in Genesis 11:30. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. And so Abraham knows these 2 things. On the one hand, painfully and tragically, his wife Sarai cannot have children, and on the other hand, Abraham will become a great nation, and God has said absolutely nothing whatsoever about Sarai having a child. So, how in the world then does Abraham think he's going to become a great nation? Well, consider this. We read, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you,' and Lot went with him. Abram took his brother's son, Lot." So God says to Abram, "Abram, leave behind all your relatives," and Abram takes his nephew. Doesn't that strike you as just a little odd? Especially when you realize that Abraham left his father behind. According to the story, Abram's father, Terah, lives for a good 65 years after Abram leaves. So God says to him, "Leave your relatives," and he leaves his father, but he takes his nephew with him. Abraham, the man with no child, takes the child who no longer has a father. Now, I wonder what that might suggest. Might it suggest that Abram thinks of Lot as being more than simply a nephew, but perhaps more of an adopted son, perhaps the one through whom the great nation will come. And if I had time, but I'm under strict orders not to have the time, to demonstrate that point, I think that I could prove that to you. Talk to me afterwards if you like. So we move on to the next episode. In chapter 15, what do we read? Beginning of chapter 15. But the word of the Lord came to him, to Abram, "This man shall not be your heir, no one but your very own issue shall be your heir." So here we meet Abraham's major learning adjustment number 2. God says to him, Abraham, about the promise, Abraham, have you thought of looking at it this way instead? And so the great nation is not going to come through Lot. It's not going to come through Eliezer of Damascus, who's mentioned in chapter 15, whoever he is. For the first time, Abraham learns that he has got to father a child. For the first time, he learns it. And of course, as we all know, sadly, Sarai cannot be the mother of this child, for from the very beginning we've been told that she is barren, and trust me, I'm a theologian, all right? God has said nothing, absolutely nothing, about Sarai conceiving and having a child. So, that's clear then. And then Sarai introduces Abraham to her Egyptian slave girl, Hagar, and the rest, as they say, is history. We read in Genesis 16 that Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. And so there we have it, just as the Lord had promised. Abraham must father a child, and Abraham does father a child. Praise the Lord for all his leading in this affair. Ishmael must be the child of promise. Ishmael, whose name means the Lord will hear, and he has. That's why Abraham and Sarah are so content with Ishmael. So, that's clear then. Until God says, Abraham, about this promise, Abraham, have you thought of looking at it this way instead? And we read this in Genesis 17. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." And Abraham replies, Sarah? Sarah? You never said anything about Sarah. The whole idea is so preposterous. He laughs out loud and he falls flat on his face. And then comes the telling statement. And Abram said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." Abraham is content with Ishmael. He's been willing to learn this and unlearn that, but he's not willing to unlearn this. This is Abraham's Ishmael moment. So then, Abraham's major learning adjustment number 3. The great nation will not come through Lot, his adopted heir. It will not come through Ishmael, this biological son. No, the promise will come through a child born of the union of Abraham and Sarah themselves. So, that's clear then. Sarah is as crucial to the fulfillment of this promise as Abraham himself always has been, and he learns that for the first time in this part of the story. So why in the world then do we next read this in chapter 20? From there Abram journeyed toward the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. Why does Abraham risk losing Sarah, especially when he knows that she is now indispensable for the fulfillment of the promise? Is it that he doesn't believe the promise? Or is it simply that he prefers Ishmael? Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight, remember. And then, of course, wonderful news. Wonderful news. Well, God has to send in the cavalry to save Sarah, but after that, wonderful news in chapter 21. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he'd said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he'd promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abram a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. And so at last we get the fulfillment of this promise with all its twists and turns and ups and downs. Every element matches up here. Abraham the father, check. Sarah the mother, check. A child born to both of them, check. All the lines, they all match up. This must be the story, the story's climax, the fulfillment. The promise comes to its glorious fulfillment at this point. So that's clear then. Until Abraham's major learning adjustment, number 4, at the beginning of chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." After these things, God tested Abraham. After what things in particular? Well, after trusting in Lot as his heir, being content with Ishmael as his heir, after passing his wife Sarah off as his sister repeatedly, and a whole lot more that I haven't had time for, after these things, God tested Abraham. And the result? The Lord said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Now I know. Now I know that you fear God. In other words, before this, there was room for doubt. Abraham, in this story, has had to learn many things and unlearn many, many things. But it appears that even God himself learns something about Abraham. Now I know. So let's visit Abraham, shall we, as he's returned from Mount Moriah. We approach his tent during the heat of the day, and he prepares food for us. We sit around the table, having a chat, and then one of us asks Abram a question. So, Abram, have you learned anything lately? And he replies, learned anything? Well, where do I begin? Well, first up, I now realize that God doesn't tell you everything all at once. He kept feeding me a piece of information, one piece at a time, until the whole picture became clear. Now, I freely admit that God has had to be patient with me, but now I realize that I need to be patient with God as well. And another thing, I realize now that I was better at preservation than I was at innovation. I was content with what I had. But now I realize that living faith, true faith, the faith that pleases the Lord, has to be creative, pushing the boundaries, taking risks, willing to look at the same old thing from a completely different point of view, being willing to move on with God. But as you all know, my problem was that I was content with Ishmael. And listening to Abraham, perhaps we could ask ourselves, have there been times, individually or as a church, when we've really wanted to hang on to Ishmael? Preservation rather than innovation. For it seems to me that one of the dangers of being an Adventist Christian, particularly these days, is to see ourselves primarily as preservers of the past rather than innovators for the present and for the future. That is, if we truly do believe that the Lord has yet new things to bring forth from his word. Unless, of course, we're content with Ishmael. The Tate Gallery in London is one of the premier art galleries in the United Kingdom. And ever since it opened its doors in 1897, it arranged its exhibits in thematic displays. But then in 2013, there was a complete rethink, and the whole gallery was rehung, but this time, not thematically, but chronologically. And here's the interesting point. Exactly the same exhibits, but just rearranged. And the result? A completely different story emerges when you visit the gallery, because each exhibit is now in a different context. You're having to relate it to something else. You get a different perspective on everything that's going on. And the estimates of this rehang of the gallery by critics, they've said it is triumphant, gloriously satisfying, unexpectedly beautiful. It seems to me that as we move through the story of Abraham, the story of Sarah, that's really what God was doing at various points in that story. He was rehanging the promise which he had given to them, saying, Abraham, about the promise, Abraham, have you thought of looking at it this way instead? You know, my promise hasn't changed. That remains the same. But I think if you just have the guts, mate, to look at it from a different point of view, it'll make all the difference to your life. And my point is that we need to rehang Adventism so that it is more obviously centered on our Lord Jesus Christ. So that people who these days don't give it a second thought will then say, now I get it. Yeah. It's triumphant, isn't it? Gloriously satisfying. Unexpectedly beautiful. And how might we rehang the Adventist gallery? Well, have you considered this? Why not move creation from contentious arguments and rehang it between social responsibility and Christian joy? Move the Sabbath from legal obligation and rehang it between justice and celebration. Move the second coming from dry apocalyptic calculations and rehang it between hope and trust. Move the scriptures from theological controversy and rehang them between imagination and wonder. In other words, learn how to rethink Adventism. As Abraham journeyed through the promise, he had to work through several major learning adjustments as God led him to the fulfillment of his promise. And perhaps we might need to consider some major learning adjustments as the Lord leads us to the fulfillment of our promise, the Advent hope. That is, with Abraham, we might need to learn how not to be content with Ishmael.